Hi, I'm Dorothy. My daughter-in-law, Cassandra, looked me straight in the eye during our family dinner and said, "We're adults now, Dorothy. We don't need you or your husband meddling in our lives anymore." She had no idea that the next morning, while she was posting vacation photos on social media with my son's credit card, I was sitting at my kitchen table rewriting my will and removing her family from a $3.2 million inheritance. The look on her face when my lawyer read those changes aloud 3 months later was absolutely priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You know they say respect your elders, but some people need to learn that lesson the hard way. My name is Dorothy Pemberton, and at 68 years old, I thought I'd seen everything life had to offer. My husband Harold and I had built a comfortable life in the quiet town of Millfield Grove, where we'd raised our 3 children and watched them grow into what we hoped were respectful, grateful adults. Harold and I weren't born wealthy, mind you. We started with nothing but determination and a small hardware store that Harold inherited from his father. Over 43 years of marriage, we worked side by side, reinvesting every penny back into our business, living modestly and saving diligently. We expanded from that single hardware store into Pemberton Building Supply, which became the largest construction supply company in 3 counties. By the time we were ready to step back from the daily operations, our business was worth nearly $2 million. Combined with our real estate investments, retirement accounts, and the family property that had been in Harold's family for generations, we had accumulated what most people would consider a substantial estate, worth approximately $3.2 million. Now, we weren't flashy about our wealth. We still lived in the same modest 2-story house we'd bought 35 years ago, drove practical cars, and shopped at the same grocery store we'd been going to for decades. But we were proud of what we'd built, and more importantly, we were excited about being able to leave something meaningful to our children and grandchildren. Our oldest son, Thomas, had always been responsible and respectful. He lived 2 states away with his wife Jennifer and their twin daughters, visiting whenever they could and always expressing genuine gratitude for any help we provided. Our daughter Rachel was similar, married to a wonderful man named David, with 2 beautiful boys, and they'd settled just 20 minutes from us in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. But then there was our youngest son, Michael. He was 32, charming when he wanted to be, but had always struggled with direction. He'd bounced between jobs, relationships, and what he called finding himself for most of his 20s. We'd helped him financially more times than I care to count, covering rent when he was between jobs, paying off credit card debt, even buying him a car when his old one broke down. 2 years ago, Michael met Cassandra at some trendy bar in the city. She was 28, worked as a marketing coordinator for a small startup, and seemed to have a stabilizing influence on him. When they got engaged after dating for only 8 months, Harold and I had our concerns, but we kept them to ourselves. We wanted Michael to be happy, and if Cassandra made him happy, then we were willing to embrace her as part of our family. The wedding was beautiful, though expensive. Harold and I contributed $25,000 toward the celebration because Michael and Cassandra claimed that they were building their future together and needed help getting started. We were happy to invest in what we hoped would be a successful marriage. At first, everything seemed fine. Cassandra was polite during family gatherings, smiled at the right times, and seemed genuinely interested in becoming part of our family. She'd ask about our business, our health, and our plans for retirement. She even suggested that she and Michael would love to help us with anything we needed as we got older. But as the months passed, subtle changes began to emerge. The phone calls became less frequent. When we'd invite them for Sunday dinner, there was always some other commitment, a friend's birthday party, a work event, or simply being too exhausted from their busy lives. When they did visit, Cassandra spent most of her time scrolling through her phone or making comments about how outdated our house was, or how we really should modernize various aspects of our lifestyle. The real shift happened about 6 months after their wedding.
Harold had been experiencing some health issues, nothing serious, just the normal aches and pains that come with being 71 years old. I'd been feeling overwhelmed managing both his care and trying to keep up with some of the business decisions that still required our input. During one of our rare family dinners, I mentioned that it would be wonderful to have the family closer, especially as Harold and I navigated this new phase of our lives. I wasn't asking for anything specific, just expressing that we valued family support and connection during what could be challenging times ahead. That's when Cassandra's true colors began to show.
"Dorothy," she said, setting down her fork with a slight attitude, "you and Harold have been independent your whole lives. Surely you're not planning to become one of those elderly couples who expects their children to drop everything and take care of them." I was taken aback by her tone, but I tried to respond diplomatically. "Of course not, dear. We're just appreciating family time and the support that comes naturally when people care about each other." "Well," Cassandra continued, "Michael and I are building our own life. We're adults now, and we have our own responsibilities and goals. We can't be expected to revolve our lives around your needs." Michael sat there silently, not defending his parents or addressing his wife's inappropriate tone. That silence hurt almost as much as her words. But the conversation that changed everything happened 3 weeks later, during what would turn out to be our last family dinner for quite some time. Harold had mentioned that we were updating our estate planning and wanted to discuss our intentions with the children so everyone would understand our wishes and there wouldn't be any surprises or family conflicts later on. This is something responsible parents do. Communicate openly about inheritance and end-of-life planning. Cassandra immediately perked up, but not in the way I expected. "How much are we talking about?" she asked directly, as if she were negotiating a business deal rather than participating in a family conversation. Harold explained that we wanted to ensure all 3 children and their families would be taken care of, and that we'd structured things to be fair and meaningful for everyone involved. "Fair is relative," Cassandra said. "Michael has helped you to the most over the years, and he's the one who will probably need to deal with your affairs when the time comes. It seems like his portion should reflect that additional responsibility." I could feel my face getting hot. Michael hadn't helped us with anything. We'd been helping him financially for years, and the assumption that he'd be handling our affairs was news to us, considering Thomas was our designated executor and had been involved in our business planning for the past decade. "Actually," I said carefully, "Thomas has been helping us with business and legal matters, and all 3 children will share equally in our estate." That's when Cassandra's mask completely slipped. She stood up from the table, her voice rising with indignation. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Dorothy. You and Harold still think you can control everyone and make all the decisions. We're adults now. We don't need you or your husband meddling in our lives anymore. We're perfectly capable of managing our own finances and making our own choices, without your interference or your guilt trips about family obligations." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Harold's labored breathing. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the disbelief that someone would speak to his wife this way in their own home. "We can take care of ourselves," she continued, "and frankly, it's insulting that you think we need to sit around waiting for inheritance money like some kind of charity case. Keep your money. We'll build our own wealth, our own legacy, without depending on handouts from people who use their money to manipulate and control their adult children." She grabbed her purse and headed toward the door. "Come on, Michael, we're leaving." Michael followed her out without saying a word, without apologizing, without even looking back at his parents who had just been verbally attacked in their own home by someone they'd welcomed into their family and supported financially. As I sat at that dinner table, watching Harold's face crumple with hurt and disappointment,
I made a decision that would change our family forever. The next morning, while Cassandra was probably sleeping in or planning her next social media post, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, my reading glasses, and my laptop, researching estate planning attorneys and preparing to make some very significant changes to our will. If Cassandra and Michael didn't need us or our money, I was going to make sure they got exactly what they asked for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. People always assume that wealth just happens overnight, that successful people were somehow born lucky or had everything handed to them. But let me tell you about the real story behind the Pemberton name and how Harold and I built something from absolutely nothing. When Harold and I got married in 1980, we had exactly $847 in our joint savings account and a dream that felt bigger than our small-town reality. Harold was 28, working for his father's tiny hardware store in Millfield Grove, a store that was barely making enough to keep the lights on. The building was old, the inventory was outdated, and most of the customers were elderly farmers who bought their supplies on credit that sometimes never got paid. Harold's father, George Pemberton, was a good man but not a businessman. He'd inherited the store from his own father and had simply maintained it without any vision for growth or improvement. When George passed away in 1982, Harold and I inherited more debt than assets, along with a building that needed major repairs and a customer base that was shrinking every year.
I was 26 then, working as a secretary at the county courthouse for $4.50 an hour. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment above the hardware store, and our idea of a date night was splitting a pizza and watching rented movies on our secondhand television. We didn't have family money to fall back on, no trust funds or wealthy relatives who could help us turn things around. But what we did have was something that money can't buy: a work ethic that refused to accept failure, and a partnership built on absolute trust and shared sacrifice. While other young couples our age were going out to bars and taking vacations, Harold and I were spending every evening and weekend transforming that struggling hardware store. I'd handle the books, the ordering, and the customer service during the day, then come home and help Harold reorganize inventory, clean the store, and plan for the next day's challenges. We made a decision early on that every single penny we earned would go back into the business. For the first 5 years of our marriage, we lived on my courthouse salary and put Harold's entire income from the store into improvements, new inventory, and paying down the debt we'd inherited. It wasn't glamorous work. I remember Harold coming home covered in dust and paint, his hands cut up from moving heavy equipment, completely exhausted but still excited to tell me about a new supplier he'd found, or a customer who'd mentioned needing something we didn't currently stock. I'd spend my lunch breaks at the courthouse calling suppliers, negotiating better prices, and researching what other successful hardware stores were doing in bigger cities. The breakthrough came in 1987 when the county announced plans to build a new residential development just outside Millfield Grove. Harold realized this meant construction companies would need a reliable local supplier for materials, not just nails and screws, but lumber, concrete, roofing materials, everything required to build homes from the ground up. That's when we made the biggest gamble of our lives. We took out a second mortgage on the building, borrowed against everything we owned, and transformed Pemberton Hardware into Pemberton Building Supply. We expanded into the empty lot next door, hired our first 2 employees, and stocked inventory worth more money than we'd ever seen in our lives. The first year nearly killed us, both financially and physically. Harold was working 14-hour days, and I was managing the books while still keeping my courthouse job to ensure we had steady income for our personal expenses. There were nights when I'd find Harold asleep at his desk, surrounded by invoices and supply catalogs, planning how to serve customers better than anyone else in the region. But it worked.
The construction companies appreciated having a local supplier who understood their needs, maintained quality inventory, and could deliver materials on schedule. Word spread that Pemberton Building Supply was reliable, honest, and committed to customer service in ways that the big chain stores simply couldn't match. By 1990, we were able to hire 4 more employees and had established relationships with contractors throughout 3 counties. By 1995, we'd built a second location in Cedar Falls. By 2000, Pemberton Building Supply was the go-to source for construction materials for anyone building anything within a 50-mile radius of Millfield Grove. But even as our business grew and became successful, Harold and I never changed our core values or our lifestyle. We still lived in the same house we'd bought in 1985, a modest 2-story home with 3 bedrooms and a small yard where I grew vegetables every summer. We still drove practical vehicles, shopped carefully, and treated every dollar with the respect that comes from knowing exactly how hard it was to earn. The wealth we accumulated wasn't from flashy investments or get-rich-quick schemes. It was from 43 years of showing up every day, treating customers fairly, paying our employees well, and reinvesting in our community. When other businesses struggled during economic downturns, we survived because we'd built relationships, not just transactions. By the time Harold and I were ready to step back from daily operations in 2020, Pemberton Building Supply was employing 26 people, serving customers throughout the region and generating the kind of steady, reliable income that comes from decades of consistent effort and smart decision-making. This wasn't just a business to us, it was our legacy, our contribution to a community that had supported us through every challenge and celebrated every success. When young families moved to Millfield Grove and built their dream homes using materials from our supply company, we felt genuinely proud of the role we'd played in helping them create something lasting. That's the foundation Harold and I built together, not through luck or inheritance or shortcuts, but through partnership, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to doing things the right way, even when it was difficult. We raised our 3 children, Thomas, Rachel, and Michael, in this environment, hoping they'd learn the values that had made our success possible: hard work, respect for others, gratitude for opportunities, and understanding that everything worthwhile requires effort and dedication. For the most part, it worked. Thomas and Rachel grew up understanding that success comes from effort, that respect must be earned, and that family means supporting each other through challenges and celebrating each other's achievements.
But Michael was different. As our youngest, maybe we spoiled him a little too much. Maybe we made life too easy for him, stepping in to solve problems instead of letting him learn from natural consequences. Whatever the reason, Michael grew up with a sense of entitlement that Harold and I never intended to foster. And when Michael married Cassandra, we realized that some people look at a lifetime of hard work and see not inspiration, but simply an inheritance they believe they deserve without having to earn it themselves. That realization would change everything. The first real sign that Cassandra viewed our family differently than we'd hoped came during Michael's birthday celebration last spring. We'd planned what we thought would be a lovely family gathering at Riverside Gardens, one of the nicest restaurants in Cedar Falls. Harold and I had invited Thomas and Jennifer with their twins, Rachel and David with their boys, and of course Michael and Cassandra. The evening started pleasantly enough. Everyone was chatting. The grandchildren were excited to see each other, and the atmosphere felt warm and familial. Harold had made a reservation for our usual large table in the back corner, where we could talk without disturbing other diners, and I had arranged for the restaurant to bring out a special birthday cake I had ordered from their pastry chef. As we were settling in and looking over the menus, Cassandra made an observation that should have been my first warning about her true character. "This place is so quaint," she said, looking around with what I initially interpreted as appreciation,
but later realized was condescension. It's like stepping back in time, isn't it? Very traditional. Thomas raised an eyebrow. We've been coming here for family celebrations for over 15 years. The food is excellent, and the service is always impeccable. Oh, I'm sure it's fine for what it is, Cassandra replied, scrolling through her phone while she talked. Michael and I usually prefer that new fusion place downtown, Zenith. Much more contemporary atmosphere, innovative menu. This is more like where my grandparents would choose to eat. The comment stung, but I tried to brush it off. Different people have different tastes, and maybe she was just trying to share her preferences, albeit tactlessly. But as the evening progressed, Cassandra's comments became increasingly pointed and inappropriate. When Harold mentioned that he'd been having some issues with his knee and was considering physical therapy, she responded with barely concealed impatience. Harold, you really should consider that at your age, these kinds of problems are just going to become more frequent. Have you and Dorothy thought about what you're going to do when you can't maintain your current lifestyle? I mean, that big house, the yard work, driving everywhere. We're managing fine, I interjected, feeling defensive. Harold's knee is a minor issue, and we have no plans to change our living situation. I'm just being practical, Cassandra said with a shrug. Michael and I were discussing this the other night. At some point, elderly parents become a responsibility for their children. It's better to plan ahead than to wait until there's a crisis. Rachel looked shocked. Cassandra, Mom and Dad are hardly elderly or incapacitated. They're both in excellent health and completely independent. For now, Cassandra replied pointedly. But realistically, how long can that last? And when things change, someone's going to have to step up and handle the situation. The table fell uncomfortably silent. Even the grandchildren seemed to sense the tension and had stopped their usual chatter. Harold's face was flushed, and I could see he was struggling to maintain his composure. Thomas cleared his throat. I think we should focus on celebrating Michael's birthday instead of having hypothetical conversations about future scenarios that may never materialize. But Cassandra wasn't finished. She leaned back in her chair with the confidence of someone who believed she was stating obvious truths that everyone else was simply too polite to acknowledge. Look, I understand that this might be uncomfortable to discuss, but Michael and I are the ones who live closest to Dorothy and Harold. Geography makes us the logical choice for handling any future caregiving responsibilities. It just seems fair that if we're going to be taking on that burden, we should have some input into decisions that affect our lives. What kind of decisions? Harold asked quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Well, for instance, this house situation. You two are rattling around in a 4-bedroom house with a big yard and multiple levels of stairs. At your age, it makes more sense to downsize to something manageable. A nice condo or maybe one of those senior living communities. You could sell the house, eliminate the maintenance responsibilities, and have a nest egg for future medical expenses. I felt my heart racing with a combination of anger and disbelief. Cassandra, we love our home. We've lived there for nearly 40 years, raised our children there, and have no intention of selling it. I understand the emotional attachment, she said in a tone that suggested she understood nothing of the sort. But emotion isn't practical. And if something happens to one of you, the surviving spouse shouldn't be burdened with property maintenance and upkeep. That's enough, Rachel said, firmly. This conversation is completely inappropriate. But Cassandra was just getting started. She turned to Michael, who had been sitting silently through this entire exchange, and said, "Tell them about what we discussed regarding the business." Michael shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. Cassandra continued without his input.
Michael and I have been talking about the future of Pemberton Building Supply. Obviously, Harold can't run a business forever, and it seems wasteful to have such a valuable asset just sitting there without anyone from the family actively involved in growing it. Thomas has been helping us with business planning and decision-making for years, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Thomas lives 2 states away, Cassandra replied dismissively. How much actual day-to-day involvement can he really provide? Michael, on the other hand, is right here, available, and interested in learning the business. This was the first I'd heard of Michael's supposed interest in our company. In 32 years, he'd never expressed curiosity about how we'd built Pemberton Building Supply or shown any inclination toward the construction industry. "When did Michael express this interest?" Harold asked, looking directly at his son. Michael finally spoke, though he couldn't meet his father's eyes. "Cassandra and I have been talking about our future, and she thinks it would make sense for me to get involved with the family business." "She thinks," I repeated. "What do you think, Michael?" The pause was telling. "I mean, it could be good. For everyone. For the family." Cassandra jumped back into the conversation. "What we're saying is that it makes sense to start transitioning responsibilities now, while Harold can still provide guidance, rather than waiting until there's some kind of emergency or health crisis." "And what would this transition look like?" Thomas asked, his attorney instincts clearly activated. "Well, Michael could start by learning the operational side of the business. Eventually, he could take over management responsibilities, and Harold could step back into more of a consulting role. It would ensure the business stays in the family and provides security for everyone involved." The audacity was breathtaking. Cassandra was essentially outlining a plan for Michael to inherit control of a business he'd never worked in, knew nothing about, and had never shown interest in, simply because she'd decided it made financial sense for their future. But she wasn't done with her presentation. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling to what appeared to be notes she'd prepared in advance. "I've actually been doing some research," she announced, as if she were presenting a business proposal rather than ambushing her in-laws during a family dinner. "Based on the tax assessments and business licensing information that's publicly available, I estimate that Pemberton Building Supply is worth approximately $1.8 million, and your real estate holdings probably add another $800,000 to $1 million in total assets." The restaurant seemed to fade around us. Other diners' conversations became white noise. Even the grandchildren had stopped eating and were staring at their aunt with confusion and something that looked like embarrassment. "That's not really appropriate dinner conversation," Jennifer said quietly, trying to redirect attention back to Michael's birthday celebration. "I'm just being practical," Cassandra repeated, apparently oblivious to the shock and discomfort she was causing. "These are conversations that every family needs to have. Dorothy and Harold have built something valuable, and it's smart planning to discuss how to preserve and grow that value for the next generation." "By discussing our private financial information in a restaurant?" Harold asked, his voice barely controlled. "By facing reality instead of pretending these issues will resolve themselves," Cassandra shot back. "Michael and I are trying to be responsible about planning our future, which includes understanding what resources will be available to us as we start thinking about buying a house, having children, and building our own wealth." There it was. The truth beneath all the talk about helping us and being practical and thinking about our future care needs. Cassandra had researched our financial situation and was calculating her potential inheritance, like an investment portfolio she was planning to manage. But the final blow came when she turned to address the entire table, including our other children and their spouses. "Look, I know this might be uncomfortable, but someone needs to say what everyone is thinking. Dorothy and Harold are getting older, and at some point, decisions are going to need to be made about their care, their assets, and their future. Michael and I are willing to take on those responsibilities, but it's only fair that we have some input into the planning process and some understanding of what we're working with." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel was staring at Cassandra with open disgust. Thomas looked like he was calculating whether it would be worth the legal fees to sue someone for presumption. Jennifer was focused on keeping the twins occupied and away from the adult drama unfolding around them. And Harold was looking at his youngest son with an expression I'd never seen before. Disappointment so profound, it was physically painful to witness. "Michael," Harold said quietly, "is this how you feel? That your mother and I are burdens you need to manage, and our life's work is an asset you need to understand for planning purposes?" "Dad, that's not... Cassandra didn't mean it like that." "How did she mean it then?" I asked, my voice shaking with hurt and anger. Michael couldn't answer. He sat there, caught between his wife's financial calculations and his family's shocked disappointment, unable to defend either position convincingly. That's when Cassandra made her final, unforgivable statement. "I think everyone is overreacting," she said, her tone suggesting that she was the reasonable person trying to deal with irrational family drama. "All I'm doing is acknowledging what everyone already knows but is too polite to discuss. Michael and I are young, energetic, and financially motivated. We're the logical choice to help Dorothy and Harold navigate their later years and to ensure that the family assets are managed properly. If that makes people uncomfortable, maybe it's because they haven't been thinking practically about these issues themselves." She stood up from the table, gathering her purse and coat. "Michael, I think we should go. Clearly, this family isn't ready for honest conversations about planning for the future." And with that, she walked out of the restaurant, leaving Michael to scramble after her with mumbled apologies and promises to call us later. The birthday celebration was ruined. The cake went uneaten. The grandchildren asked why Aunt Cassandra was angry and why Uncle Michael had left without saying goodbye. But most devastatingly, Harold and I realized that our youngest son had married someone who saw us not as parents deserving respect and love, but as aging assets to be managed and eventually inherited. The weeks following Michael's disastrous birthday dinner revealed just how deeply Cassandra's calculating attitude had infected our family relationships. What I initially hoped was an isolated incident of poor judgment turned out to be the beginning of a systematic campaign to position herself as the primary decision-maker in our lives. 3 days after the restaurant confrontation, Michael called to apologize for how the evening ended. But instead of acknowledging his wife's inappropriate behavior, he tried to reframe the entire situation as a misunderstanding. "Mom, Cassandra feels terrible about how things went," he said, though his tone suggested he was reading from a script she'd prepared. "She was just trying to be helpful, you know? She's really good with financial planning and organization, and she thought maybe she could assist you and Dad with some of the business decisions you've been stressed about." "We haven't been stressed about business decisions, Michael," I replied carefully. "Your father and I have been successfully managing our affairs for over 40 years. I know, but Cassandra has experience with corporate strategy from her marketing job, and she noticed some opportunities for growth that might benefit everyone. She didn't mean to overstep, she just gets excited about problem solving." The manipulation was subtle, but unmistakable. Cassandra had convinced Michael that her invasive financial calculations and presumptuous planning were actually generous offers of assistance that we were too stubborn or proud to appreciate. But the phone call that truly opened my eyes to Cassandra's intentions came the following week. I was in the garden tending to my tomato plants when Harold called me inside to listen to a voicemail Michael had left on our landline. "Hi, Mom and Dad, it's Michael. Cassandra and I have been talking, and we wanted to follow up on some of the ideas we discussed at dinner. We know you might need time to think about everything, but we don't want to lose momentum on planning for the future. Cassandra has some specific suggestions about the house situation and the business transition that could really benefit everyone involved. Maybe we could set up a time to sit down and go through her proposals in detail. She's put together some research and projections that I think you'd find really impressive. Anyway, call us back when you get a chance." Harold and I looked at each other in stunned silence.
Cassandra had taken our shocked rejection of her inappropriate dinner conversation and transformed it into a business opportunity. She was treating our family relationships like a corporate acquisition she was negotiating. The next phase of her campaign began with what appeared to be friendly check-ins, but were actually intelligence-gathering missions. Cassandra started calling me directly, usually when Harold was at his weekly golf game with his longtime buddies. "Hi, Dorothy. I just wanted to see how you're doing," she'd begin sweetly. "I know Harold has been having some issues with his knee. Has he scheduled that appointment with the orthopedic specialist yet?" When I'd update her on Harold's perfectly manageable health situation, she'd respond with exaggerated concern. "Oh, that sounds more serious than Michael and I realized. You know, my friend Brenda went through something similar with her father. It started with knee pain, and within 6 months, he needed a walker. Are you sure Harold should still be driving? What if something happens while he's out alone?" She was planting seeds of doubt about our independence and capability, trying to create a sense of crisis that would justify her intervention in our lives. The calls became more frequent and more intrusive. She'd ask about our grocery shopping habits, our home maintenance schedules, our social activities, always with the pretense of caring concern, but clearly gathering information about our daily routines and potential vulnerabilities. "Dorothy, I noticed when we were at your house last month that the front porch steps seem a little uneven. Have you had anyone look at that? Falls are such a serious risk for people your age. Michael and I were talking, and we think it might be time to have a professional assess the house for safety issues. We'd be happy to arrange that for you."
When I assured her that our home was in excellent condition and that we were perfectly capable of maintaining it, her tone would shift slightly. Of course. I just worry because you and Harold are so independent that you might not notice when things start to become challenging. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to identify potential problems before they become serious. The outside perspective she was referring to, of course, was herself. But the most damaging aspect of Cassandra's campaign was how she was systematically undermining our relationships with our other children and grandchildren. During family phone calls, she'd make subtle comments designed to position herself as the responsible family member who was stepping up to handle the difficult conversations that everyone else was avoiding. When Thomas called to check on us after hearing about the restaurant incident, Cassandra managed to insert herself into the conversation. "Thomas, I'm so glad you called," she said, having apparently taken the phone from Michael. "I've been trying to talk to your parents about some practical planning issues, but I think they're more comfortable hearing these things from you. Could you maybe talk to them about the house situation? I'm concerned about them managing such a large property, especially if Harold's mobility continues to decline." She was trying to recruit Thomas as an ally in her efforts to pressure us into decisions we didn't want to make. When Thomas refused to support her agenda, she shifted tactics. "I understand why you might not want to get involved, living so far away," she said, in a tone that implied his geographical distance made him less committed to our welfare. "Michael and I are just trying to make sure your parents have the support they need, since we're the ones who are here and available if something happens." The implication was clear. Thomas and Rachel were neglectful children who had abandoned their aging parents, while she and Michael were the responsible ones stepping up to handle family obligations. She employed the same strategy with Rachel, calling her directly to express concern about our declining health and our stubbornness about accepting help with daily tasks that were supposedly becoming too challenging for us to manage independently. "Rachel, I'm worried about your parents. Your mom seems overwhelmed lately, and your dad is clearly struggling with mobility issues. I've offered to help with things like grocery shopping and house maintenance, but they keep insisting they can handle everything themselves. Maybe they'd be more receptive to assistance if it came from you." When Rachel assured her that we were managing perfectly well and didn't need assistance with our daily activities, Cassandra would respond with disappointed sighs. "I hope you're right. I just see them more frequently than you do, and I notice changes that you might not pick up on during occasional visits. But maybe I'm being overly cautious. I just care about them so much, and I want to make sure they're safe and comfortable." The manipulation was sophisticated.
She was creating a narrative where she was the concerned, attentive daughter-in-law who was more aware of our needs than our own biological children, while simultaneously portraying us as aging, declining, and in denial about our limitations. The most insidious part of her campaign was how she was working to isolate us from our support network. She'd call our friends and neighbors, expressing concern about our welfare and asking them to report back to her if they noticed any signs that we were struggling. Our neighbor Betty Morrison mentioned during one of our regular coffee visits that Cassandra had stopped by while we were out running errands. "She seemed very worried about you two," Betty said. "She was asking whether you'd noticed you having trouble with yard work or if Harold seemed unsteady when he walks to the mailbox. She said the family was concerned about you living alone in such a big house." "We're not living alone," I said, confused. "Harold and I live together, and we're both perfectly healthy." "That's what I told her," Betty replied. "But she seemed to think there were problems I might not be noticing. She asked me to call her if I ever saw you struggling with anything or if I thought you needed help." Cassandra was essentially recruiting surveillance agents among our friends and neighbors, trying to build a case that we were declining and needed family intervention in our lives. The breaking point came 6 weeks after the restaurant incident when Harold and I received an unexpected visit from Janet Holbrook, a social worker from the county's Aging Services Department. "Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton," she said politely when we answered the door, "I received a call from a family member expressing concern about your welfare and requesting a wellness check. I'm required to follow up on these reports to ensure elderly residents in our community are safe and receiving appropriate care." Harold and I were mortified. In 68 years of life, I had never been subjected to a government wellness check, as if we were incapacitated or neglected elderly people who couldn't care for ourselves. "Who called you?" Harold asked, though we both already knew the answer. "I can't reveal the specific identity of the person who made the report, but they expressed concern about your ability to maintain your home safely, the potential mobility issues, and what they described as increasing confusion about financial matters."
The allegations were completely fabricated, but we had to endure a 40-minute interview about our health, our daily routines, our social connections, and our financial management capabilities. Janet examined our home, checked our refrigerator for adequate food supplies, reviewed our medications, and asked detailed questions about our support network and emergency contacts. "You both seem to be doing very well," she concluded, clearly puzzled by the report that had prompted her visit. "Your home is well maintained, you're both cognitively sharp, and you appear to be managing your daily activities without any difficulty. I'm not sure why someone felt a wellness check was necessary." After she left, Harold and I sat at our kitchen table staring at each other in disbelief. Our daughter-in-law had called social services and filed a false report about our competency and welfare. She had involved government agencies in her campaign to undermine our independence and justify her interference in our lives. That evening, Michael called with an apology that was clearly orchestrated by Cassandra. "Mom, Dad, I heard about the social worker visit today. I'm really sorry about that. Cassandra was just worried after some things she'd heard from neighbors, and she thought maybe someone official should check on you guys to make sure everything was okay. She didn't mean for it to be embarrassing or anything." "Michael," Harold said, his voice deadly quiet, "your wife filed a false report with social services, alleging that your mother and I are incapacitated and unable to care for ourselves. That's not concern, that's harassment." "Dad, she was just trying to help." "No, son. She was trying to build a case that we're incompetent so she can justify taking control of our lives and our assets. And apparently, she's convinced you to help her do it." The silence on the other end of the line lasted nearly a minute. "I'll talk to her," Michael finally said. But I knew he wouldn't. And I knew that Cassandra's campaign of manipulation and sabotage was only going to escalate until she got what she wanted: control of our family, our business, and our future. That night, lying in bed next to Harold, I made a decision that would change everything. If Cassandra wanted to treat us like aging assets to be managed rather than people deserving respect, she was about to learn exactly how much control those assets actually had. The morning after the social services incident, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. For weeks, I'd been reacting to Cassandra's manipulation and harassment, feeling defensive and hurt by her calculated attacks on our independence and dignity. But lying there in the early dawn light, listening to Harold's steady breathing beside me, I realized that being reactive was exactly what she wanted. She thrived on chaos, confusion, and emotional responses that made us appear unstable or overwhelmed. If Cassandra wanted to play strategic games with our family, she was about to discover that Harold and I hadn't built a multi-million-dollar business by being naive or unprepared for calculated opponents. My first call that morning was to Thomas, not to complain about his brother's wife or to seek emotional support, but to have a practical conversation about protecting our assets and our autonomy. "Thomas," I said when he answered, "I need you to recommend an estate planning attorney who specializes in complex family situations, someone who understands how to structure wills and trusts to prevent manipulation and challenges." "Thomas, what's going on? Is this about Cassandra's behavior at Michael's birthday?" "It's about much more than that dinner, honey. Your father and I need to make sure our estate planning reflects our actual wishes and values, not someone else's assumptions about what we should do with our assets." Thomas was quiet for a moment. As an attorney himself, he understood the implications of what I was saying. "Are you talking about changing your will?" "I'm talking about making sure our will accurately represents our intentions and protects against people who might view our family relationships as financial opportunities rather than genuine connections based on love and respect." Within 2 days, Thomas had arranged for me to speak with Margaret Thornfield, a specialist in estate planning and elder law who had handled some of the most complex family asset disputes in the state. Margaret was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, and had the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of family greed and manipulation. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said during our phone consultation, "Thomas has given me some background about your situation. Before we discuss specific legal strategies, I want to understand your primary concerns and objectives." I explained Cassandra's behavior, the social services report, and her systematic campaign to position herself as our caretaker and eventual inheritor. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific incidents and their documentation. "What you're describing is unfortunately common," she said when I finished. "Adult children or their spouses sometimes view aging parents as assets to be managed, rather than people deserving respect and autonomy. The good news is that there are legal mechanisms to protect against this kind of manipulation." Margaret explained several options for restructuring our estate planning to ensure our wishes would be honored and our assets would go to people who had demonstrated genuine care for our welfare, rather than calculated interest in our wealth.
"The key," she said, "is documentation. We need to clearly establish your current competency, your understanding of your assets, and your reasoning for any changes you make to your estate plan. This creates a legal record that makes it much more difficult for anyone to challenge your decisions later." While I was speaking with Margaret, Harold was conducting his own research. He'd called our longtime accountant, Robert Hayes, to get a complete assessment of our current financial situation and to discuss strategies for protecting our business from potential interference. "Harold," Robert said during their meeting, "I've been handling your finances for 15 years, and I can tell you that your current estate structure makes you vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation you're describing. If something happened to one of you, and if Michael was influenced by someone with financial motivations, there are ways they could potentially complicate the business succession or challenge your asset distribution." Robert recommended several immediate steps to protect our interests. First, we should update all of our financial account beneficiaries and ensure that our business succession plan was ironclad. Second, we should document our current mental capacity and decision-making abilities through medical and psychological evaluations. Third,
We should create a comprehensive record of our reasoning for any changes to our estate planning. The goal, Robert explained, is to make it legally impossible for anyone to claim you were coerced, confused, or incompetent when you made these decisions. Harold and I spent the following week undergoing evaluations with our family physician, Dr. Patricia Williams, and with a geriatric psychologist, Dr. Stephen Martinez. Both assessments confirmed what we already knew. We were mentally sharp, fully capable of making complex decisions, and completely competent to manage our own affairs. Dr. Williams documented our excellent physical health and cognitive function in detailed reports that would become part of our legal file. Dr. Martinez administered comprehensive psychological testing that demonstrated our mental acuity, emotional stability, and clear understanding of our financial situation and family relationships. Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton, Dr. Martinez said when he reviewed our test results, your cognitive function is in the top percentile for people your age. You show no signs of confusion, impaired judgment, or decision-making difficulties. Anyone who suggested you needed assistance with daily living activities or financial management was either mistaken or deliberately misrepresenting your capabilities. Armed with professional documentation of our competency, Harold and I began the process of completely restructuring our estate planning. But we did it quietly, without involving Michael or giving Cassandra any indication that her behavior had prompted us to take protective action. Margaret Thornfield drew up new wills, new trust documents, and new business succession plans that reflected our actual values and priorities. Instead of automatically dividing our assets equally among our 3 children, the new documents created a merit-based distribution system that rewarded demonstrated respect, genuine care, and positive contributions to our family relationships. Thomas and Rachel would inherit the bulk of our estate because they had consistently shown love, respect, and genuine concern for our welfare. They had never treated us as burdens to be managed or assets to be inherited. They had supported our independence, celebrated our achievements, and maintained loving relationships based on mutual affection rather than financial expectations. Michael's inheritance was reduced to a modest trust fund that would provide him with some financial security, but wouldn't give him access to the kind of wealth that had apparently motivated Cassandra's campaign of manipulation. The trust was structured so that Cassandra would have no legal claim to any of the funds, regardless of her marital status with Michael. Pemberton Building Supply would be transferred to Thomas, who had the business experience, legal expertise, and genuine interest in preserving what Harold and I had built. The transition would be managed by a professional management company until Thomas could decide whether to relocate and take active control of the operations or to oversee the business remotely while maintaining its current management structure. Our house and personal property would go to Rachel, who lived nearby and had always expressed appreciation for our home and the memories it contained. She would have the option to live there, sell it, or use it as she saw fit, without interference from other family members. But the most important aspect of our new estate planning wasn't the asset distribution. It was the detailed documentation of our reasoning. Margaret had advised us to create comprehensive written statements explaining why we had made specific decisions about our inheritance and what factors had influenced our choices. I spent hours writing what amounted to a letter to my family, explaining how Cassandra's behavior had demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of family relationships and personal worth. I documented specific incidents, quoted her exact words, and explained how her actions had shown disrespect not just for Harold and me, but for the values and principles that had guided our entire lives. Inheritance should reflect relationships based on love, respect, and genuine care. It should go to people who have demonstrated through their actions that they understand the effort and sacrifice required to build something meaningful. Cassandra has shown through her words and behavior that she views Harold and me as aging assets to be managed rather than parents deserving respect and autonomy. Harold wrote his own statement, focusing on the business succession and his disappointment in Michael's failure to defend his parents against his wife's inappropriate behavior.
Michael had many opportunities to demonstrate respect for his mother and me, to show that he valued our relationship more than his wife's financial calculations, Harold wrote. His silence during her attacks on our dignity and his participation in her campaign to undermine our independence have shown us that he shares her values rather than the values his mother and I tried to instill in him. The entire process took 6 weeks to complete. During that time, Cassandra continued her harassment campaign, apparently unaware that her behavior was being meticulously documented and was directly influencing decisions that would affect her future in ways she couldn't imagine. She called regularly to check on our declining health, made surprise visits to gather intelligence about our daily activities, and continued to pressure Michael to approach us about business succession planning and living situation changes. She even reached out to our pastor, Reverend James Morrison, expressing concern about our spiritual welfare and our apparent resistance to accepting help from family members. "Dorothy," Reverend Morrison said when he called me after Cassandra's visit, "I'm a bit confused. Cassandra seemed very worried about you and Harold, but when I see you both at church every Sunday, you seem perfectly fine. Are there problems I should know about?" I explained the situation briefly, and Reverend Morrison was appalled. "I've known you and Harold for over 20 years, he said. "You're both vital, independent people who are very capable of managing your own lives. If someone is suggesting otherwise, they're either seriously mistaken or they have ulterior motives." Even our banker, Patricia Freeman at Millfield Grove Community Bank, received a call from Cassandra requesting information about our accounts and expressing concern about our ability to manage our finances responsibly. "Mrs. Pemberton," Patricia said when she called to ask about the inquiry, "I told the caller that I couldn't discuss your accounts with anyone other than you or Harold, but I wanted you to know that someone claiming to be your daughter-in-law was asking detailed questions about your banking relationships and suggesting that the family was concerned about your financial management capabilities." The audacity was breathtaking. Cassandra was essentially conducting a public campaign to undermine our reputation and competency, apparently believing that if she could convince enough people that we were declining, she could justify taking control of our affairs. But what she didn't know was that every phone call, every inappropriate inquiry, and every attempt to gather information about our private business was being documented by the very people she was trying to manipulate. Our friends, neighbors, professional contacts, and community members were reporting back to us about her behavior, creating a comprehensive record of her harassment campaign. By the time our new estate planning documents were finalized and legally filed, we had built an unassailable case demonstrating that our decisions were based on documented behavior rather than emotional reactions or diminished capacity. Margaret Thornfield reviewed the completed documents with us one final time. "Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton, these documents are legally bulletproof. Your capacity has been professionally verified, your reasoning is thoroughly documented, and your decisions are clearly based on rational analysis of family relationships and demonstrated behavior. If anyone attempts to challenge these arrangements, they'll be facing an overwhelming amount of evidence supporting your competency and your right to distribute your assets according to your own values and priorities." Harold and I looked at each other across Margaret's conference table. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely peaceful about our family's future. Cassandra had spent weeks trying to position herself as our caretaker and eventual inheritor. She had harassed us, manipulated our son, and attempted to undermine our relationships with friends, neighbors, and professional contacts. What she didn't realize was that her campaign of calculated cruelty had accomplished exactly the opposite of what she intended. Instead of convincing us that we needed her management and oversight, she had demonstrated beyond any doubt that she was exactly the kind of person who should never have control over assets that represented a lifetime of honest work and genuine care for others. The new will was signed,
witnessed, and legally filed. Our assets were protected, our wishes were clearly documented, and our family's future was secure from the kind of manipulation and financial abuse that Cassandra represented. Now, all we had to do was wait for the right moment to let her know that her behavior had consequences she never saw coming. Over the following months, while Cassandra continued her campaign of manipulation and harassment, Harold and I quietly implemented changes that would protect not just our estate, but our entire legacy from people who viewed our life's work as their personal entitlement. The legal protections were just the beginning. We realized that simply changing our will wouldn't address the broader issue of ensuring our business and assets continued to reflect our values after we were gone. If we wanted to guarantee that our wealth would be used to build rather than simply consume, we needed to create structures that would outlast any individual family member's poor judgment. Working with Margaret Thornfield and a team of financial advisors, we established the Pemberton Family Foundation, a charitable trust that would receive 30% of our estate and continue our tradition of supporting the Millfield Grove community long after Harold and I were no longer here to oversee those efforts personally.
The foundation would fund scholarships for local students pursuing careers in skilled trades and business management, support small business development in our region, and maintain the community programs that Harold and I had quietly supported for decades. Thomas would serve as the foundation's president, with Rachel as vice president, ensuring that our charitable giving would continue to reflect genuine care for others, rather than the superficial charity work that Cassandra had used for tax write-offs and social media appearances. But the foundation was more than just charitable giving. It was a statement about what we valued and what we wanted our legacy to represent. Every dollar that went to help a young person start a business or learn a trade was a dollar that wouldn't be available for someone who viewed inheritance as unearned income, rather than a responsibility to continue building something meaningful. While we were establishing these long-term protections, Cassandra's behavior continued to escalate in ways that provided us with even more documentation for our legal files. She had apparently decided that if she couldn't convince us to voluntarily transfer control of our affairs to her, she would need to demonstrate to others that we were incompetent to manage our own lives. Her campaign expanded beyond our immediate social circle to include our professional contacts and business relationships. She called our insurance agent, our property management company, and even our landscaping service, expressing concern about our ability to make sound decisions and requesting that they contact her if they noticed any signs that we were struggling with basic tasks. "Mrs. Pemberton," said Janet Walsh from Millfield Insurance, "I received a rather strange call from someone claiming to be your daughter-in-law. She was asking about your policy details and suggesting that you might need assistance understanding your coverage options. I told her I couldn't discuss your account with anyone other than you, but she seemed quite insistent that the family was worried about your capacity to handle financial decisions." Each of these incidents was carefully documented by Margaret Thornfield's office, creating an increasingly comprehensive record of Cassandra's harassment and attempted interference with our business relationships. What she apparently didn't understand was that by contacting our professional service providers, she was actually strengthening our legal case by demonstrating a pattern of inappropriate behavior to witnesses who had no family bias or emotional investment in the outcome. The most damaging revelation came when Harold discovered that Cassandra had been conducting online research about our business and financial status, apparently trying to build a case that we were mismanaging our assets and needed family intervention. She had accessed public tax records, business registration information, and property assessments, then used this data to create what appeared to be a detailed financial analysis of our declining business performance. "Dorothy," Harold said, showing me printouts he'd found in Michael's car when he borrowed it to run errands. "Look at this. Cassandra has been tracking our business revenue, property values, and investment accounts. She's created spreadsheets projecting what she calls potential losses due to mismanagement and opportunities for growth under proper supervision." The documents were breathtaking in their presumption and calculation. Cassandra had apparently spent considerable time researching our finances and had developed what amounted to a business plan for taking control of our assets.
She'd identified what she considered inefficiencies in our business operations, criticized our conservative investment strategies, and outlined how she would restructure our holdings to maximize returns. Most disturbing was a section titled Transition Strategy that detailed how she planned to gradually assume responsibility for our decision-making capacity, starting with small financial tasks and eventually taking over complete management of our affairs. The document included timelines, milestone objectives, and contingency plans for overcoming our resistance to necessary changes. "She's been planning this for months," Harold said, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "This isn't emotional manipulation or misguided concern. This is a calculated campaign to take control of everything we've built." But Cassandra's detailed documentation of her intentions turned out to be a gift for our legal protection efforts. Margaret Thornfield reviewed the materials with evident satisfaction. "This is remarkable evidence of premeditation and financial motivation. These documents make it impossible for anyone to claim that your estate planning changes were based on misunderstanding or overreaction to minor family conflicts. This shows systematic planning to undermine your autonomy and assume control of your assets." While Cassandra was plotting her takeover strategy, Harold and I were implementing protective measures she could never have anticipated. We transferred ownership of Pemberton Building Supply to a family business trust that would prevent any single individual from gaining control without unanimous agreement from all trust beneficiaries. The trust was structured so that even if someone gained access to business documents or financial information, they couldn't make operational changes or access funds without approval from multiple parties, including our legal and financial advisors. We also established what Margaret called competency triggers in all our legal documents. These provisions required that any challenges to our decision-making capacity would need to be supported by comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations conducted by professionals we selected, not by anyone who might have financial motivations for declaring us incompetent. The beauty of these triggers, Margaret explained, is that they shift the burden of proof to anyone claiming you're not competent to make your own decisions. Instead of having to prove your capacity after someone challenges it, they would need to provide overwhelming medical evidence to overcome the presumption of your competency.
The protective measures extended beyond legal documents to practical safeguards for our daily lives. We updated our banking relationships to include additional security measures that would prevent unauthorized access to our accounts. We established procedures with our healthcare providers to ensure that medical information could only be shared with people we specifically authorized. We even arranged for our mail to be delivered to a post office box, preventing anyone from intercepting important financial or legal documents. These weren't the actions of paranoid elderly people. They were the practical steps that any business owners would take to protect valuable assets from potential threats. Harold and I had spent decades protecting our business from various risks, and we applied the same strategic thinking to protecting ourselves from Cassandra's calculated campaign. But perhaps the most important protection we established was rebuilding and strengthening our relationships with Thomas and Rachel. Cassandra's manipulation had created distance and confusion among our children, and we realized that the best defense against her influence was ensuring that our other children understood the true situation and were prepared to support our decisions. We arranged separate visits with Thomas and Rachel, during which we shared the full scope of Cassandra's behavior, showed them the documentation we'd gathered, and explained the protective measures we'd implemented. Both of them were shocked by the extent of Cassandra's planning and manipulation. "Mom," Rachel said after reviewing Cassandra's financial analysis documents, "this is terrifying. She's been treating you and Dad like a business acquisition she's planning to take over. No wonder you felt the need to change your estate planning." Thomas, with his legal background, was particularly disturbed by Cassandra's systematic approach to undermining our autonomy. "This goes way beyond normal family conflict," he said. "This is a deliberate campaign to establish legal grounds for claiming you're incompetent to manage your own affairs. If you hadn't taken protective action when you did, she might have eventually succeeded in convincing a court that you needed a guardian or conservator." Both Thomas and Rachel agreed to serve as additional witnesses to our competency and decision-making capacity.
They committed to regular communication with us and to being available to provide testimony if anyone ever challenged our mental capacity or the validity of our estate planning decisions. The support from our older children was emotionally healing, but it also served a practical purpose. By involving them in our protective planning, we ensured that they understood and supported our decisions, making it much more difficult for anyone to claim that we had been manipulated or coerced into changing our wills. Over the course of 8 months, while Cassandra was plotting her takeover of our lives and assets, Harold and I had quietly built a comprehensive defense system that protected not just our wealth, but our autonomy, our dignity, and our right to make our own decisions about our family's future. We had transformed from reactive victims of her manipulation into strategic architects of our own protection. Every legal document was bulletproof. Every financial account was secured. Every business relationship was protected by clear procedures and professional oversight. Most importantly, we had created a legacy structure that would ensure our values and priorities would continue to guide the use of our wealth long after we were gone. The foundation would support community development and individual opportunity. The business trust would preserve what we'd built while preventing any single person from using it for purely personal gain. The inheritance distribution would reward demonstrated love and respect while denying resources to people who had shown they valued money more than family relationships. Cassandra had spent months trying to position herself as our eventual caretaker and inheritor. What she didn't realize was that her systematic campaign of manipulation and harassment had convinced us that she was exactly the kind of person who should never have control over resources that represented a lifetime of honest work and community building. By the time we were finished implementing our protective measures, we had created something she never could have anticipated, a comprehensive system that made her plans impossible to execute while ensuring that our actual values would guide our family's future for generations to come. The foundation was established, the trusts were funded, the new will was legally bulletproof, and our competency was professionally documented. We had taken every possible precaution to protect ourselves, our assets, and our legacy from someone who had demonstrated that she viewed family relationships as financial opportunities rather than bonds of genuine affection. Now, all that remained was waiting for the right moment to let Cassandra know that her months of calculated planning had accomplished exactly the opposite of what she intended. Instead of positioning herself to inherit our wealth, she had systematically eliminated herself from any meaningful role in our family's future. The reckoning was coming, and she had no idea that every manipulative phone call, every inappropriate inquiry, and every attempt to undermine our independence had been carefully documented and had directly influenced decisions that would affect her life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. 10 months after we'd completed our legal protections, fate delivered an opportunity so perfectly ironic that it felt like the universe itself was orchestrating justice. The catalyst came in the form of a phone call that would ultimately give us the chance to reveal to Cassandra exactly what her months of manipulation and harassment had accomplished.
It was a Tuesday morning in early October when Michael called, and for the first time in months, his voice carried genuine distress rather than the rehearsed concern that had characterized most of his recent conversations with us. "Mom, Dad," he said, and I could hear tears in his voice, "I need to talk to you about something serious. Can Cassandra and I come over tonight? We really need your help." Harold and I exchanged glances across our breakfast table. After months of Cassandra positioning herself as our future caretaker, the idea that they needed our help was both surprising and deeply ironic. "Of course, Michael," I said carefully. "What's going on?" "I can't really explain over the phone. It's complicated, and it involves some decisions that could affect our whole future. We were hoping to get your advice about what to do." That evening, Michael and Cassandra arrived at our house looking like they'd aged years in the past few weeks. Michael's usual confident demeanor was replaced by obvious anxiety, and even Cassandra seemed subdued, lacking the calculating energy that had characterized all of her previous interactions with us. "Thank you for seeing us," Cassandra said as we settled in our living room. And for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely humble rather than manipulatively polite. Michael took a deep breath before speaking. "Mom, Dad, we're in serious financial trouble. Not just tight money or credit card debt.
We're looking at potentially losing everything if we can't figure out a solution in the next 60 days. The story that unfolded over the following hour was a masterpiece of poor judgment and financial irresponsibility that had been building for months while Cassandra was focused on planning her takeover of our assets. It began with Cassandra's decision to leave her marketing job 6 months earlier to start her own consulting business. She'd convinced Michael that her corporate experience made her qualified to provide strategic advice to small businesses and that working for herself would be more lucrative than her previous salary. "I had clients lined up," Cassandra explained, her usual confidence replaced by defensive uncertainty. 3 companies had expressed serious interest in ongoing consulting relationships. The income projections looked very promising. But projections and reality had proven to be very different things. The consulting business had generated less than $8,000 in 6 months, while Cassandra had invested over $25,000 in office equipment, marketing materials, and what she called business development expenses. Simultaneously, Michael had been convinced to leave his steady job at a local insurance agency to join Cassandra's venture as her business partner. His role would be client relations and business development, leveraging his social connections to generate leads for her consulting services. "We thought it made sense," Michael said miserably. 2 incomes from the same business, building something together, being our own bosses. Cassandra had researched the market and was confident we could be making 6 figures within the first year. The market research had apparently been as flawed as Cassandra's previous assessments of our family finances. Small businesses in our region were struggling with their own economic challenges and had little interest in paying for consulting services they couldn't afford. The few clients they'd managed to attract had been dissatisfied with Cassandra's theoretical advice and had terminated their contracts after short trial periods. But the failed business venture was only part of their financial catastrophe. Convinced that their consulting income would rapidly grow, they had taken on additional expenses that now seemed recklessly optimistic. They'd moved from their modest apartment to an expensive rental house in the upscale Meadowbrook neighborhood, tripling their monthly housing costs. They'd purchased 2 new cars, financing them with loans based on projected income rather than actual earnings. Most devastatingly, they'd borrowed $40,000 against Michael's retirement account to fund the business startup costs and their elevated lifestyle during what Cassandra had called their investment period. "We were so sure the business would take off," Cassandra said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely vulnerable rather than manipulatively polite. "I thought we just needed to get through the initial phase." The initial phase had lasted 6 months and had consumed their savings, maxed out their credit cards, and left them facing monthly expenses of nearly $4,800 while generating less than $1,000 in actual income. The retirement loan required immediate repayment since Michael was no longer employed by the company that had sponsored his 401k plan. The car payments, rent, and credit card minimum payments were consuming more money than they could hope to earn from any traditional employment they might be able to find quickly. "We've been trying to figure this out on our own," Michael said, "but the numbers just don't work. Even if we both found good jobs immediately, we'd still be looking at bankruptcy unless we can find a way to pay off some of these debts and get our monthly expenses down to a manageable level." Harold asked the obvious question. "Have you considered selling the cars and moving back to less expensive housing?" "We're upside down on the car loans," Cassandra admitted. "We owe more than they're worth, so selling them wouldn't eliminate the debt. And our lease has 10 months remaining with significant penalties for early termination."
I could see where this conversation was heading, and the irony was almost overwhelming. After months of Cassandra calculating the value of our assets and planning how she would eventually inherit our wealth, she was sitting in our living room asking us to provide the financial rescue she needed to avoid the consequences of her own poor decisions. "What kind of help are you hoping we can provide?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Michael and Cassandra looked at each other, and I could see they'd rehearsed this part of the conversation. "We were hoping you might consider providing a loan," Michael said carefully. "Something that would let us pay off the high-interest debt and get our monthly expenses down to where we could manage them with regular jobs. We'd pay you back with interest, and we'd be willing to sign legal documents making it official." "How much of a loan?" Harold asked.
We calculated that $75,000 would be enough to pay off the credit cards, cover the early lease termination fee, and give us a few months of living expenses while we both find steady employment, Cassandra said, pulling out a folder that contained what appeared to be detailed financial projections. $75,000. They were asking us to provide more money than most families earn in 2 years to rescue them from the consequences of decisions they'd made, while simultaneously planning to take control of our assets because they didn't trust our judgment. But the most extraordinary part of their request wasn't the amount. It was Cassandra's complete lack of awareness about how her previous behavior might affect our willingness to help them. She presented her case with the same calculating confidence she'd shown when researching our finances and planning her takeover strategy. She had spreadsheets showing how the loan would improve their situation, timelines for repayment, and projections for their future earning potential once they'd stabilized their circumstances. "I know this is a significant amount," she said, "but it's really an investment in our family's future. Once we get back on our feet, we'll be able to contribute more to family relationships and be available to help you and Harold as you continue aging." There it was again. Even while asking for our financial rescue, Cassandra couldn't resist implying that we were declining and would eventually need her assistance. She was positioning the loan not just as help for their immediate crisis, but as an investment in their ability to someday manage our lives. "This would also give Michael and me the stability we need to start thinking about having children," she continued. "I know you both want grandchildren, and this financial stress has made it impossible for us to consider expanding our family." The manipulation was breathtaking. She was suggesting that our willingness to provide a massive loan would determine whether we'd have grandchildren from our youngest son. She was using the promise of future family relationships as leverage for immediate financial assistance. Harold and I listened to their entire presentation without interruption. They had clearly spent considerable time preparing their case, anticipating our questions, and developing responses to potential objections. Cassandra had even researched family loan structures and tax implications, demonstrating the same analytical approach she'd applied to studying our assets and planning her eventual inheritance. When they finished their presentation, they looked at us with hopeful expectation, apparently confident that we would agree to provide the financial rescue they needed. "This is obviously a significant decision," I said carefully. "Your father and I will need some time to discuss this and consider our options." "Of course," Michael said quickly. "We understand this is a lot to ask, but we wanted to present all the information so you could see that we've really thought this through and we have a realistic plan for getting our lives back on track." "When do you need an answer?" Harold asked. "The retirement loan deadline is in 6 weeks. If we can't pay that off by then, there are significant penalties that would make our situation much worse. So realistically, we need to know within the next few weeks so we can make arrangements." After they left that evening, Harold and I sat in our living room looking at the financial documents Cassandra had left for our review. The projections were detailed, the timeline seemed realistic, and the repayment plan appeared feasible if they both found steady employment quickly. But none of that mattered, because Cassandra had no idea that her months of harassment, manipulation, and calculated planning to take control of our lives had been systematically documented and had directly influenced our decision to restructure our entire estate to exclude her from any meaningful inheritance. She was asking us to loan her $75,000 to rescue her from her own poor judgment, while remaining completely unaware that her behavior had cost her access to a $3.2 million inheritance. She was positioning the loan as an investment in family relationships while having no idea that she had already destroyed those relationships through her systematic campaign to undermine our autonomy and dignity. The cosmic justice was perfect. Cassandra needed our help desperately, but she had spent months proving that she viewed us as assets to be managed rather than parents deserving respect. She was asking for our trust and financial support while having demonstrated that she saw our wealth as her future entitlement rather than something we had earned through decades of honest work.
"Harold," I said as we prepared for bed that night, "I think it's time to let Cassandra know exactly what her behavior has accomplished."
What do you mean?
"I mean, it's time to reveal what we've been doing while she was plotting to take over our lives. It's time to let her know that her months of calculation and manipulation have had consequences she never anticipated." Harold smiled for the first time in weeks.
When do you want to tell them? Let's invite them for breakfast on Saturday. I'll make my famous pancakes, and we'll have a nice family meal before we share the news about our estate planning changes. Should we tell them about the will first, or about whether we'll provide the loan? I thought about that for a moment, considering the perfect symmetry of the situation. Let's tell them about the loan first, I said. Then we'll explain exactly why we made that decision. I think it's important for Cassandra to understand the connection between her behavior and its consequences. As I lay in bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine anticipation mixed with a deep sense that justice was finally going to be served. Cassandra had asked for $75,000 while remaining completely unaware that her harassment campaign had cost her access to over $3 million in inheritance. Saturday morning couldn't come soon enough. The days between Tuesday's desperate plea and Saturday's planned breakfast passed with a strange mixture of anticipation and careful preparation. Harold and I had waited 10 months for the perfect opportunity to reveal what Cassandra's systematic harassment had accomplished, and we were determined to handle this moment with the precision it deserved. On Wednesday morning, I called Margaret Thornfield to inform her about the upcoming confrontation and to ensure we had all necessary documentation readily available. "Mrs. Pemberton," Margaret said after I explained the situation, "this is an interesting development. They're asking you for significant financial assistance while remaining completely unaware that their behavior has eliminated them from your estate planning. Do you want me to be present during this conversation?" "I don't think that will be necessary," I replied. "Harold and I are fully capable of handling this discussion ourselves, but I would like you to prepare a complete summary of our estate planning changes, including the specific incidents that influenced our decision-making process. I want to be able to provide them with detailed documentation of how their actions led to these consequences." Margaret agreed to prepare what she called a comprehensive impact statement that would clearly connect Cassandra's behavior to our legal responses. The document would include dates, specific incidents, and explanations of how each action had influenced our decision-making process. The key, Margaret advised, is to present this information factually rather than emotionally. You want them to understand that these were rational business decisions based on demonstrated behavior, not emotional reactions to temporary family conflicts. On Thursday, I spent several hours reviewing our files and organizing the documentation we'd accumulated over the past months. The sheer volume of evidence was remarkable. Phone records showing Cassandra's frequent calls to our friends and service providers, copies of her financial analysis documents, reports from the social services wellness check, testimonies from neighbors and business contacts about her inappropriate inquiries. Each piece of evidence told part of the story of Cassandra's systematic campaign to undermine our autonomy and position herself as our eventual caretaker and inheritor. Taken together, they painted an undeniable picture of calculated manipulation that had nothing to do with genuine concern for our welfare. Harold spent Thursday afternoon calling Thomas and Rachel to inform them about Saturday's planned revelation. Both of them wanted to be present for the confrontation, but we decided it would be more effective if Harold and I handled the conversation privately. "Mom, are you sure you're prepared for how they might react? When Cassandra realizes what she's lost, she's going to be furious." "Honey, your father and I didn't build a successful business by being afraid of difficult conversations. We've been preparing for this moment for months, and we're ready to handle whatever reaction it produces." Thomas, with his legal background, was more concerned about potential challenges to our estate planning decisions. "Dad," he said to Harold, "make sure you emphasize that all of your decisions were made with full legal counsel and professional documentation. If Cassandra tries to claim you were coerced or incompetent, you want to establish clearly that these changes were rational responses to documented behavior."
Friday evening, Harold and I sat at our kitchen table and rehearsed our presentation. We decided to structure the conversation in 3 phases. First, our decision about the loan. Second, the reasons for that decision. And third, the broader consequences of Cassandra's behavior on our estate planning. I think we should let them present their case again, Harold suggested. Give them another opportunity to demonstrate their attitude and approach before we reveal what we've decided. That's a good idea, I agreed. Let them show us once more whether they see this as a family relationship based on mutual respect or as a financial transaction they're negotiating. We also prepared for various potential reactions. Cassandra might become angry and accusatory. Michael might try to defend her or distance himself from her behavior. They might attempt to negotiate or make promises about changing their approach to our family relationships. Whatever they say, I told Harold, we need to remember that we're not negotiating or reconsidering our decisions. We're simply informing them about consequences that have already been determined by their own actions.
Saturday morning arrived gray and chilly, with the kind of overcast October sky that seemed appropriate for the serious conversation we were about to have. I prepared a full breakfast: pancakes, bacon, fresh fruit, and coffee. Partly because I'd promised them my famous pancakes, but mostly because I wanted them to be comfortable and well-fed before we delivered news that would fundamentally change their understanding of their future. Michael and Cassandra arrived at exactly 10 a.m., carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained updated versions of their financial projections and loan proposals. Both of them seemed more optimistic than they had on Tuesday, as if they'd convinced themselves that we would agree to provide the financial rescue they needed. "Thank you so much for making this special breakfast," Cassandra said as we settled around our dining room table. "I know this whole situation has been stressful for everyone, and we really appreciate you taking the time to consider how you might be able to help us." The words were polite, but I noticed she was already framing our potential assistance as something we owed them, rather than something we might choose to provide out of generosity. Even in her desperation, she couldn't quite manage to approach us with genuine humility. "We've been thinking a lot about what you shared with us on Tuesday," Harold said, cutting into his pancakes. "It's clear you've put considerable thought into analyzing your situation and developing potential solutions." "We have," Michael said eagerly, "and we've actually refined our projections a little bit based on some additional research Cassandra did about job opportunities and income potential." Cassandra opened her portfolio and began pulling out updated spreadsheets and financial documents. "I've been networking with some of my former colleagues, and I'm confident I can find a position that pays significantly more than my previous job. The consulting business didn't work out as we hoped, but the experience gave me valuable skills that should make me more marketable to employers." She spread the documents across the table, pointing out various calculations and projections that supported her optimism about their ability to repay a substantial loan quickly. "We've also identified some additional cost-cutting measures. If you're willing to provide the loan, we can probably pay it back ahead of schedule, which would save everyone money on interest charges." I watched her presentation with fascination. Even while asking for our financial rescue, Cassandra was trying to frame the conversation as a business negotiation where she was offering us beneficial terms rather than requesting a massive favor from people she'd systematically mistreated. "These projections look very thorough," I said neutrally. "You've clearly put a lot of effort into understanding your options." "We have," Cassandra said, apparently interpreting my comment as encouragement. "We know this is a significant amount to ask for, but we wanted to demonstrate that we're serious about handling it responsibly and making sure everyone benefits from the arrangement." "Everyone benefits?" Harold asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, yes," Cassandra replied, missing the subtle skepticism in his tone. "Obviously, we benefit by getting our finances stabilized, but you and Dorothy benefit too. You get a good return on your investment through the interest payments, plus you have the security of knowing Michael and I are back on solid financial ground."
She paused, then continued with what appeared to be her closing argument. And frankly, this arrangement would give us the stability we need to be more available for family responsibilities. Once we're not stressed about money, we can focus on being the kind of children and in-laws you deserve. We could help more with things around the house, be available if you need assistance with errands or appointments, maybe even start thinking seriously about giving you grandchildren. There it was again. Even while desperately needing our help, Cassandra couldn't resist positioning herself as our future caretaker and suggesting that our willingness to provide financial assistance would determine the quality of our family relationships. Michael nodded along with his wife's presentation, occasionally adding supporting comments, but clearly letting her take the lead in making their case. His body language suggested he was uncomfortable with some aspects of her approach, but he wasn't willing to contradict her or suggest alternative ways of framing their request. When Cassandra finished her presentation, both of them looked at us expectantly, apparently confident that their updated projections and refined arguments had strengthened their case for receiving the loan they needed. "Thank you so much for sharing all this information with us," I said, gathering their documents into a neat stack. "Your father and I have indeed given this considerable thought over the past few days." "And we've made our decision," Harold added, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone that suggested the conversation was about to shift significantly. "Before we discuss the loan specifically, we want to share some things with you that we think will help you understand our perspective on this situation and on our family relationships more generally." I stood up and walked to our kitchen counter where I had placed the folder containing Margaret Thornfield's impact statement and our documentation of Cassandra's behavior over the past months. "You see," I said, returning to the table with the folder, "while you've been analyzing your financial situation and developing your business plans, your father and I have been doing some analysis of our own. We've been examining our family relationships, our estate planning, and our priorities for the future."
Cassandra and Michael exchanged glances, apparently sensing that the conversation was about to move in a direction they hadn't anticipated. "We've also been consulting with legal and financial professionals about the best ways to protect our assets and ensure that our wealth will be used responsibly by people who share our values and respect our contributions to this family and community." I opened the folder and removed the first document, Margaret's comprehensive summary of our estate planning changes. "What we discovered during this process," Harold said, taking over the narrative, "is that some family members have demonstrated through their actions that they view us as aging assets to be managed, rather than parents deserving respect and consideration." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Michael's coffee cup rattling slightly as he set it down on his saucer with unsteady hands. "We've also discovered," I continued, "that some family members have been conducting research into our financial affairs, making inquiries about our competency to friends and service providers, and developing plans for assuming control of our lives and assets without our knowledge or consent." Cassandra's face had gone pale, and she was staring at the documents in my hands with growing alarm. "So before we discuss your loan request," Harold said, his voice carrying the authority he developed through decades of business negotiations, "we think it's important for you to understand exactly what your behavior over the past months has accomplished and how it has influenced our decisions about our family's future." I opened Margaret's impact statement and began to read. "The following timeline documents actions taken by Cassandra Pemberton between March and October of this year and the legal responses those actions prompted." The moment of revelation had finally arrived. After months of systematic harassment and manipulation, Cassandra was about to learn that her campaign to position herself as our future inheritor had accomplished exactly the opposite of what she intended. "March 15th, I began reading from Margaret's meticulously prepared document, my voice steady and clear.
Cassandra Pemberton contacted Millfield Insurance Agency requesting detailed information about Harold and Dorothy Pemberton's policy coverage, claiming family concern about their ability to understand their insurance options. Cassandra's fork clattered against her plate as she set it down with shaking hands. "Dorothy, what is this?" "This is a comprehensive record of your behavior over the past 10 months and the legal actions we've taken in response to that behavior." I continued reading. March 22nd, Cassandra Pemberton called Betty Morrison, the Pembertons' neighbor, asking her to monitor and report on signs of declining health or inability to maintain their property. "I was just concerned about you," Cassandra interrupted, her voice rising with what sounded like panic. "I wanted to make sure you had support from people who see you regularly." March 28th, Cassandra Pemberton contacted Riverside Landscaping Services, expressing concern about the Pembertons' ability to make sound decisions regarding property maintenance and requesting notification if they observed any signs of confusion or impaired judgment. Michael was staring at his wife with growing horror. "Cassandra, you called their landscapers?" April 5th. Cassandra Pemberton called the County Aging Services Department, filing a report alleging that Harold and Dorothy Pemberton were experiencing cognitive decline and needed a wellness check to assess their ability to live independently. "You filed a false report with social services," Harold said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger I'd rarely heard from him in 43 years of marriage. "You brought government agencies into our home based on fabricated concerns about our mental capacity." Cassandra's face had gone from pale to flushed red. "Those weren't fabricated concerns. I genuinely worried about you both. Maybe I made some mistakes in how I approached it, but my intentions were good." I turned the page and continued. April 12th. Harold Pemberton discovered detailed financial analysis documents in Michael Pemberton's vehicle, created by Cassandra Pemberton, containing unauthorized research into the Pembertons' business assets, property values, and investment accounts. "You researched our private financial information?" Harold asked, looking directly at his son. "Michael, did you know she was doing this?" Michael couldn't meet his father's eyes. "She said she was just trying to understand the family's situation so we could be helpful if you needed assistance." "Helpful?" I asked, pulling out copies of Cassandra's spreadsheets from the folder. "This is what you call helpful?" I spread the documents across the table, showing her detailed calculations of our net worth, her projections for business growth under different management, and her timeline for gradually assuming control of our decision-making without our knowledge. "This document," Harold said, pointing to one particular spreadsheet, "shows your wife's plan for taking over our business operations within 18 months. It includes strategies for overcoming what she called our resistance to necessary changes." Cassandra tried to grab the documents, but I moved them out of her reach. "Those were private planning documents. You had no right to take them from Michael's car." "We had every right to protect ourselves from someone who is systematically planning to undermine our autonomy. These documents show premeditation, Cassandra. This wasn't concern for our welfare. This was a calculated campaign to take control of our assets." I returned to Margaret's report. May 15th. Cassandra Pemberton contacted Pemberton Building Supply's primary banking institution, claiming to be calling on behalf of the family and requesting information about account management and potential concerns about the account holder's competency. "They called the bank?" asked Michael, his voice barely above a whisper.
June 3rd. Cassandra Pemberton visited Reverend James Morrison, expressing concern about Harold and Dorothy Pemberton's spiritual welfare and requesting that he monitor their behavior for signs of declining judgment or increased confusion. "You involved our pastor," Harold's voice cracked slightly. "You tried to convince our spiritual counselor that we were losing our minds?" "I was building a support network," Cassandra said desperately.
I wanted to make sure people who care about you were aware of potential problems so they could help if needed. Support network or surveillance network? I asked, because according to this documentation, you contacted 17 different people and organizations, asking them to monitor our behavior and report back to you about our supposed decline. I pulled out another document from the folder. This is a statement from Janet Walsh at our insurance agency, describing your call requesting detailed information about our policies and your suggestion that we might not be capable of understanding our coverage options. And this, Harold added, retrieving another paper, is a statement from Patricia Freeman at our bank documenting your attempt to access information about our accounts by claiming family authority you don't possess. Cassandra looked around the table desperately, as if searching for some way to reframe the mounting evidence of her systematic harassment. You're making this sound much worse than it was. I was trying to be responsible, to make sure you had the support you might need as you got older. As we got older? I asked. Cassandra, we're 68 and 71. We're not declining elderly people who need management. We're competent adults who built a successful business and have been managing our own affairs for over 40 years. But you were showing signs, she insisted, her voice becoming more frantic. You were resistant to practical suggestions. You seemed overwhelmed by simple decisions. Michael and I could see that you needed help, even if you couldn't admit it yourselves. What signs? What decisions were we overwhelmed by? Give us specific examples of this declining competency you claim to have observed. Cassandra opened her mouth, then closed it again. She couldn't provide examples, because there weren't any. Her entire campaign had been based on manufactured concerns rather than observed problems. Michael finally spoke up, his voice shaking. Mom, Dad, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Cassandra was just trying to be helpful. Maybe she made some errors in judgment, but she wasn't trying to hurt you or take control of anything. Michael, I said gently, your wife spent months developing detailed plans for assuming control of our business and our personal affairs. She researched our finances, contacted our service providers, and filed false reports with government agencies. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a systematic campaign. I pulled out the most damaging document from our file. This is Cassandra's transition strategy document, which outlines her timeline for gradually taking over our decision-making responsibilities. Phase 1 was establishing a network of people who would report concerns about our competency. Phase 2 was documenting incidents that could be interpreted as evidence of our declining abilities. Phase 3 was presenting herself as the logical family member to assume greater responsibility for our care and financial management. Harold leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his daughter-in-law. Cassandra, this document shows you were planning to manipulate our family, our friends, and our community into believing we were incompetent so you could justify taking control of our lives. I wasn't trying to... Cassandra's composure was completely shattered now. Her tears were streaming down her face, but whether they were from guilt, frustration, or fear was impossible to determine. You researched the value of our assets. You calculated potential inheritance amounts. You developed strategies for overcoming our resistance to your management. This wasn't about our welfare, Cassandra. This was about your financial future. I stood up and walked to our kitchen counter, returning with another folder that contained the estate planning documents Margaret had prepared. Which brings us to the consequences of your behavior, Harold said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used in business negotiations for decades. Consequences? Michael asked weakly. Michael, your wife spent months treating us like aging assets to be managed rather than parents deserving respect. I opened the new folder.
She demonstrated through her actions that she viewed our wealth as her future inheritance rather than something we had earned through decades of hard work. She showed us, Harold continued, that she was more interested in positioning herself to control our assets than in maintaining genuine family relationships based on love and mutual respect. I pulled out the first page of our new will and placed it on the table where they could both see it clearly. So, we made some changes to our estate planning that reflect our actual values and priorities. Changes that ensure our wealth will go to people who have demonstrated genuine care for our welfare rather than calculated interest in our assets. Cassandra's eyes widened as she began to comprehend what she was seeing. What kind of changes? The kind that protect our legacy from people who mistake inheritance for entitlement. Michael leaned forward to look at the document, and I watched his face transform from confusion to understanding to absolute shock. Mom, what does this mean? It means, I said calmly, that your wife's campaign to position herself as our future caretaker and inheritor has had exactly the opposite effect of what she intended.
I pulled out Margaret's summary of our estate restructuring and placed it next to the will documents. Thomas and Rachel will inherit the bulk of our estate because they have consistently demonstrated respect, love, and genuine concern for our welfare. They have never treated us as burdens to be managed or assets to be inherited. The Pemberton Family Foundation will receive 30% of our estate to continue our tradition of supporting community development and individual opportunity, Harold added. And Michael, I continued, looking directly at our youngest son, you will receive a modest trust fund that will provide some financial security but will not give you access to the kind of wealth that apparently motivated your wife's behavior. The silence that followed was profound. Cassandra was staring at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. Michael looked like he'd been physically struck. How much? Cassandra finally managed to ask. How much what? Harold replied. How much? What's the trust fund worth? Even in her shock and devastation, her first question was about money. She couldn't ask about repairing relationships or understanding our feelings or finding a way to rebuild trust. She wanted to know the dollar amount of what she'd lost. The trust is structured to provide Michael with approximately $2,000 per month for life, I said. It's enough to supplement whatever income he earns through his own work, but it's not enough to live on without employment. $2,000 a month? Cassandra's voice was barely audible. Out of a $3 million estate? Out of a $3.2 million estate, Harold corrected. The rest goes to people who understand that wealth is a responsibility, not an entitlement. But we're family, Michael said, desperately. I'm your son. Doesn't that count for anything? Being our son means everything to us, Michael, I said gently. But being our son doesn't entitle you to an inheritance that you've shown you can't handle responsibly. Your wife's behavior demonstrated that you view our wealth as something you deserve rather than something we earned. This is about Cassandra's mistakes, not about Michael, Cassandra said, apparently trying to shift blame away from herself. Michael never did anything to hurt you. He was just supporting his wife. Michael had many opportunities to stand up for us when you were harassing us. He chose to remain silent while you attacked our dignity and autonomy. That silence was a choice, and choices have consequences.
I gathered the documents back into their folders, the evidence of Cassandra's systematic campaign and the legal consequences of her behavior now clearly established. So, to answer your original question about the loan, we've decided that we won't be providing financial assistance to people who have demonstrated that they view us as assets to be managed rather than family members deserving respect. The devastating reality was finally sinking in. Cassandra had asked for $75,000 to rescue her from her own poor financial decisions while remaining completely unaware that her months of harassment and manipulation had cost her access to over $3 million in potential inheritance. She had positioned herself as our future caretaker while systematically destroying any possibility of inheriting the wealth she'd been so carefully calculating and planning to control. The silence stretched on for nearly a full minute as the magnitude of what they'd just learned settled over Michael and Cassandra. I watched their faces transform through stages of disbelief, comprehension, and finally, devastating realization that their entire future had just been fundamentally altered by consequences they never saw coming. Cassandra was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "This can't be legal. You can't just change your will because you're angry about family disagreements. There are laws about elder abuse and undue influence." Harold's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Elder abuse? Cassandra, you filed false reports claiming we were incompetent. You harassed our friends, neighbors, and business associates. You conducted unauthorized research into our private finances. If anyone has engaged in elder abuse, it's you. We have comprehensive documentation of your behavior," I added, tapping the folders on the table. "Medical evaluations confirming our complete mental competency, professional assessments of our decision-making capacity, legal testimony from multiple witnesses about your harassment campaign. Our attorney assures us these changes are absolutely uncontestable." Michael finally found his voice, though it shook with emotion. "Mom, Dad, please. I know Cassandra made some mistakes, but this punishment doesn't fit what happened. We're talking about destroying our entire future over some phone calls and misguided concern." "Some phone calls?" Harold's voice rose for the first time during the entire conversation. "Michael, your wife spent 10 months systematically trying to undermine our independence and dignity. She built a case to have us declared incompetent so she could take control of our assets. This wasn't misguided concern. This was calculated financial abuse." "But I never participated in that. I didn't make those phone calls or create those documents. Why am I being punished for her actions?" I looked at my youngest son, seeing perhaps for the first time the fundamental weakness in his character that had allowed the situation to develop. "Michael, you sat silently while your wife attacked us at your birthday dinner. You allowed her to file false reports with social services. You knew she was researching our finances and planning to take control of our lives, and you never once stood up for us or told her to stop."
"I was trying to keep peace in my marriage," he said desperately. "At the expense of your relationship with your parents," Harold replied. "You chose your wife's financial ambitions over your family's dignity. That was your choice, son, and choices have consequences." Cassandra's shock seemed to be transforming into anger. Her face was flushed, her hands were clenched into fists, and her voice took on an edge I'd never heard before. "This is revenge," she said, standing up from the table abruptly. "Pure and simple revenge, because I dared to suggest that you might need help managing your affairs as you get older. You're using your money as a weapon to punish me for caring about this family's future."
Caring about this family's future? I asked, remaining seated while she loomed over the table. Cassandra, you calculated the value of our assets like a corporate acquisition. You developed strategies for taking control of our decision-making. You filed false reports, trying to have us declared incompetent. That wasn't caring. That was predatory. I was trying to protect everyone's interests, she shot back. Michael and I are young, educated, and motivated. We could have helped you grow your wealth and preserve it for future generations. Instead, you're giving it to Thomas, who lives states away and barely visits, and Rachel, who's never shown any interest in business or financial planning. The mask was completely off now. In her anger, Cassandra was revealing the calculating mindset that had driven her behavior all along. She wasn't upset about losing family relationships. She was furious about losing access to wealth she'd been counting on inheriting. Thomas and Rachel have never treated us like assets to be managed, Harold said calmly. They've never filed false reports about our competency. They've never harassed our friends and neighbors. They've never developed strategic plans for taking control of our lives. They've simply loved us and respected us as autonomous adults. But they haven't been here, Cassandra insisted. They haven't been available to help with daily needs or medical emergencies. Michael and I are the ones who would have been taking care of you when you got older. We deserve to be compensated for that responsibility. Deserved? I asked. Cassandra, nobody deserves inheritance. Inheritance is something parents choose to give based on relationships, values, and demonstrated character. You've demonstrated through your actions that you view caring for aging parents as a financial transaction rather than a family obligation based on love. Michael was crying now, silent tears streaming down his face as he realized the full implications of what had happened. Mom, there has to be some way to fix this, some way to make things right again. Cassandra can apologize. We can change how we approach family relationships. Please don't let this destroy everything. Michael, we're not destroying anything. We're protecting something. Our dignity, our autonomy, and our right to decide how our life's work will be used after we're gone. Your wife showed us that she doesn't share our values about family, respect, and earned wealth. We've simply adjusted our estate planning to reflect that reality. But what about our financial situation? The retirement loan, the credit cards, the house payments? We still need help. We're going to lose everything if we can't find a solution in the next few weeks. Harold and I exchanged glances. This was the moment we'd been anticipating, the point where Michael would have to confront the consequences of his choices without the safety net he'd been counting on. Michael, Harold said carefully, your mother and I built our wealth through 43 years of hard work, sacrifice, and responsible decision-making. We lived modestly, saved diligently, and made smart choices about how to use our resources. You and Cassandra made different choices. You quit stable jobs to pursue a risky business venture without adequate preparation or realistic market analysis. You took on debt based on projected income rather than actual earnings. You elevated your lifestyle beyond your means because you assumed our inheritance would eventually cover any financial mistakes you made. We never assumed anything about inheritance, Cassandra protested, though her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out her financial planning documents and pointed to a specific section. This spreadsheet shows your projections for family asset access within 5 to 10 years. You calculated potential inheritance amounts and factored them into your long-term financial planning. You made current spending decisions based on wealth you expected to inherit. The evidence was undeniable. Cassandra had indeed factored our assets into her financial projections, treating our wealth as a guaranteed resource for her future plans. So what are we supposed to do? Michael asked, his voice breaking. How are we supposed to fix our situation without any family support? The same way your mother and I built our wealth, through hard work, responsible spending, and making difficult choices about lifestyle and priorities. Find jobs that match your actual qualifications. Reduce your expenses to fit your income. Pay off your debts through effort and sacrifice rather than expecting family bailouts. You could sell your expensive cars and lease something affordable. break your lease, and find housing that fits your budget. Use the skills you've developed to find employment that provides steady income rather than chasing entrepreneurial dreams you're not prepared to execute.
Cassandra was pacing now, her anger and frustration evident in every gesture. This is impossible. You're basically telling us to destroy our standard of living and start over from nothing because I made some phone calls you didn't like. Some phone calls we didn't like? Harold's voice was dangerously quiet. Cassandra, you tried to have us declared mentally incompetent. You filed false reports with government agencies. You harassed our friends and professional contacts. You developed detailed plans for taking control of our lives against our will. And now you're discovering that actions have consequences, I added. You spent months calculating the value of our assets and planning how you would eventually inherit and control our wealth. You treated us like obstacles to overcome rather than parents to respect. You're not being punished for phone calls. You're experiencing the natural consequences of demonstrating that you don't share our values about family, work, or earned wealth. Michael made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. What if we got counseling? What if Cassandra and I went to therapy to work on our communication and our approach to family relationships? Would that change anything about the inheritance decisions? I looked at my son with genuine sadness. Even now, he was trying to negotiate his way back into our good graces, viewing therapy as a strategic investment that might restore his access to inheritance, rather than as genuine work to improve his character or relationships. Michael, I said softly, the estate planning changes aren't punishments that can be reversed through good behavior. They're reflections of demonstrated character and values. Cassandra showed us who she really is through her actions over many months. People don't fundamentally change their character through a few counseling sessions. Besides, Harold added, genuine remorse and behavior change would be motivated by wanting to repair relationships and rebuild trust, not by wanting to restore access to inheritance money. The fact that you're framing this as a negotiation, rather than acknowledging the genuine harm that was done, tells us that you still don't understand why we've made these decisions. Cassandra stopped pacing and turned to face us directly, her expression shifting from anger to something that looked almost like desperation. Fine. You want acknowledgement? I acknowledge that I made mistakes. I acknowledge that some of my actions were inappropriate. I'm sorry for any pain or distress I caused. The apology was hollow, delivered with the mechanical precision of someone checking boxes rather than expressing genuine remorse. There was no recognition of the specific harms she'd caused, no understanding of why her behavior had been so damaging, no indication that she would approach family relationships differently in the future. Cassandra, I said, a real apology would demonstrate understanding of what you did wrong and why it was harmful. It would include specific acknowledgement of your actions and their impact on our lives. What you just offered was a generic statement designed to minimize your responsibility while trying to negotiate better terms for your inheritance. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating whether a more detailed apology might change our minds about the estate planning. The fact that she was still strategizing rather than genuinely reflecting told us everything we needed to know about her character and motivations. I think this conversation is over, Harold said, standing up from the table. We've explained our decisions and the reasoning behind them. We've provided documentation of the behavior that influenced our estate planning. We've made it clear that these changes are final and legally protected. You have 43 years of marriage and shared sacrifice to serve as your model for rebuilding your lives. We started with nothing and built something meaningful through hard work and responsible choices. You can do the same thing if you're willing to put in the effort and make the sacrifices required. Michael and Cassandra sat at our breakfast table in stunned silence as the reality of their situation fully sunk in. They had come to our home expecting financial rescue, and instead had discovered that their behavior had eliminated them from the very inheritance they'd been counting on to secure their future. The power dynamic that Cassandra had been trying to manipulate for months had completely been reversed. Instead of positioning herself as our future caretaker and inheritor,
She had systematically destroyed any possibility of receiving the wealth she'd been so carefully calculating and planning to control. The cosmic justice was perfect, and it had been delivered over pancakes and coffee on a gray October morning in the same kitchen where Harold and I had planned our business strategies and family decisions for decades. Their financial crisis remained unsolved, their debts unpaid, their timeline unchanged. But now they would have to face those challenges without the family support they'd taken for granted and without the inheritance they'd been counting on to eventually solve all their problems. As they prepared to leave our house that morning, they were finally experiencing the consequences of treating family relationships as financial transactions and viewing aging parents as assets to be managed rather than people deserving respect and love. 3 months later, I received a phone call that perfectly illustrated how dramatically the balance of power in our family had shifted. It was a Tuesday afternoon in January, and I was reading in our sunroom when the phone rang with a number I didn't recognize.
Dorothy? The voice was Michael's, but it sounded strained and unfamiliar. It's Michael. I'm calling from a different phone because our service got disconnected yesterday. I set down my book and prepared myself for what I suspected would be another attempt to negotiate some kind of financial assistance from parents he and his wife had systematically tried to undermine. "How are you, Michael?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Not good, Mom. Not good at all." His voice broke slightly. "We lost the house. We had to move in with Cassandra's sister in Fairfield until we can figure out what to do next. The cars got repossessed last week. Cassandra's been working at a retail store in the mall, and I'm doing temporary construction work when I can get it." The contrast with the confident, calculating couple who had sat at our breakfast table 3 months earlier was striking. The people who had been planning to take control of our $3.2 million estate were now homeless and struggling to find minimum wage employment. "I'm sorry to hear you're going through such difficulties," I said, and I genuinely meant it. Despite everything that had happened, Michael was still my son, and watching him suffer brought me no pleasure. "Mom, I need to tell you something," he continued, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what happened, about the choices I made and the things I allowed Cassandra to do." I waited for him to continue, curious whether this conversation would reveal genuine insight or simply represent another strategic attempt to restore his access to inheritance. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Not just about supporting Cassandra's behavior, but about my whole approach to family and responsibility and what I thought I was entitled to. I spent months letting my wife treat you and Dad like obstacles to overcome instead of parents who deserved respect." His words sounded different from the desperate negotiations we'd heard during our breakfast confrontation. There was a quality of genuine reflection rather than calculated positioning. "I understand why you changed the will. I understand why you couldn't trust us with the family wealth. Looking back at Cassandra's behavior and at my silence while she harassed you, I realize we proved that we weren't the kind of people who should inherit something you worked so hard to build." I found myself moved by what sounded like authentic recognition of the harm that had been done. "Michael, I appreciate you calling to say that. It means more than you might realize. There's something else, Mom. Cassandra and I are getting divorced." The news didn't surprise me, but it saddened me nonetheless. Marriage requires shared values and mutual respect, qualities that had been clearly absent from their relationship. "What happened?" I asked. "Living with her sister showed me things about Cassandra that I'd been refusing to see. When she thought we might be able to rebuild our relationship with you and Dad, she spent weeks trying to develop strategies for getting back into your good graces. She researched estate law, looking for ways to challenge your decisions.
She even talked about having you declared incompetent if she could find a sympathetic doctor. The revelation was disturbing, but not shocking. Cassandra had demonstrated throughout our ordeal that she viewed family relationships as problems to be solved through manipulation and strategic planning, rather than through genuine care and respect. But the final straw was when she started blaming me for losing the inheritance. She said if I'd been more supportive of her planning and more aggressive about claiming my rightful share of your assets, we wouldn't be in this financial mess. She still doesn't understand what went wrong, I observed. No, she doesn't. Even now, she talks about you and Dad as if you were unreasonable old people who punished her for trying to help. She's convinced herself that she was the victim in all of this. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which Michael provided details about their financial collapse and his growing recognition of how fundamentally flawed his marriage had been. "Mom," he said as our call was ending, "I'm not calling to ask for money or to try to get back into the will. I know I have to rebuild my life through my own efforts, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what happened and why it happened." "I'm proud of you for that understanding, Michael. It shows a maturity I wasn't sure you'd developed." "Would it be possible," he asked hesitantly, "for me to visit sometime? Not Cassandra, she's not part of my life anymore. Just me, to see you and Dad, and maybe start rebuilding some kind of relationship that's based on respect instead of entitlement?" The request touched my heart in a way I hadn't expected. "Of course, honey. You're always welcome in our home." After I hung up, I sat in the sunroom thinking about the complete transformation of our family dynamics over the past year. Cassandra's campaign to position herself as our future caretaker and inheritor had not only failed spectacularly, but it had also ultimately freed Michael from a marriage based on calculation, rather than genuine affection. 2 weeks later, Michael arrived at our house for Sunday dinner. He looked older, wearing work clothes that showed the physical labor he'd been doing, carrying himself with a humility I'd never seen in him before. "Dad," he said when Harold opened the door, "I owe you and Mom an apology that's about 10 months overdue." The evening that followed was unlike any family gathering we'd had in years. Michael talked openly about his mistakes, his recognition of Cassandra's manipulative behavior, and his commitment to rebuilding his life through honest work rather than inherited wealth. "I spent so many years thinking I deserved things because I was your son," he said over dessert. "I never really understood that being your son was a privilege that came with responsibilities, not an entitlement that guaranteed rewards." Harold and I exchanged glances across the table. This was the kind of conversation we'd hoped to have with our youngest child for decades. "Michael," Harold said, "what are your plans now? How are you thinking about rebuilding your future?" "I am saving money to get my own apartment," Michael replied. "I'm good at the construction work, and my supervisor says there might be an opportunity for more permanent employment if I'm willing to learn additional skills. I'm thinking about taking some evening classes in project management or building trades." The contrast with his previous entrepreneurial fantasies was remarkable. Instead of chasing get-rich-quick schemes, he was talking about developing genuine skills and earning his success through consistent effort. "I've also been thinking about something else," he said, looking directly at both of us. "I know I'm not in your will anymore for the big inheritance, but I'm grateful for the trust fund you set up. $2,000 a month feels like a lot of money when you're earning it through work and living within your means." This was perhaps the most significant change in his perspective. The monthly trust payments that had once seemed insignificant compared to his inheritance expectations were now meaningful supplements to the income he was earning through his own labor. Over the following months, Michael's visits became regular occurrences. He'd stop by on Sundays for dinner, sharing updates about his job, his apartment search, and his evening classes. He helped Harold with yard work and assisted me with household projects. Not because he was trying to earn his way back into our good graces, but because he genuinely wanted to contribute to our family relationships. The transformation was so complete that Harold and I began discussing whether we should modify our estate planning to reflect Michael's demonstrated growth and maturity. "He's become the kind of person we always hoped he would be," Harold said during one of our conversations about the family's future. "Maybe his share of the inheritance should reflect that change." "I have been thinking the same thing," I replied. "But I think we should wait a little longer to make sure this transformation is genuine and lasting rather than temporary motivation created by his financial crisis." 6 months after Michael's first apologetic phone call, we received a letter that provided the perfect contrast to his genuine growth and reflection. It was from Cassandra's attorney, informing us that she was challenging our estate planning changes on the grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. Margaret Thornfield reviewed the legal challenge with evident amusement. "Mrs. Pemberton, this is exactly the kind of frivolous lawsuit our documentation was designed to prevent. We have comprehensive medical evaluations proving your competency, detailed records of her harassment campaign, and clear evidence that your decisions were rational responses to documented behavior." "Is there any possibility she could succeed?" Harold asked. "None whatsoever," Margaret replied confidently. "In fact, filing this lawsuit will probably strengthen your legal position by demonstrating that she continues to view your family relationships as financial transactions rather than genuine emotional connections." The lawsuit proceeded through the courts for several months, providing us with regular reminders of Cassandra's continued inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of her actions. Her legal filings consistently portrayed us as confused elderly people who had been manipulated into making irrational decisions, despite overwhelming evidence of our mental competency and clear reasoning. When the case was finally dismissed with prejudice, meaning Cassandra could never file another challenge to our estate planning, Margaret sent us a copy of the judge's ruling. The decision included language that described Cassandra's claims as entirely without merit and noted that the evidence demonstrates a systematic pattern of harassment by the plaintiff against the defendants. Meanwhile, Michael continued his steady progress toward rebuilding his life. He completed his evening classes, earned promotion to supervisor at his construction job, and moved into a modest apartment that he furnished with his own earnings and decorated with pride rather than entitlement. A year after our breakfast confrontation, Harold and I made a decision that reflected both justice and family healing. We called Margaret Thornfield and asked her to revise our estate planning one final time. "We want to increase Michael's inheritance," I told her during our meeting. "Not back to the original equal share because that would ignore the lessons learned from this experience, but to a level that reflects his demonstrated growth and genuine change." The revised will provided Michael with a more substantial inheritance while maintaining the larger shares for Thomas and Rachel, who had never wavered in their respect and care for us. The Pemberton Family Foundation remained a major beneficiary, ensuring that our charitable values would continue long after we were gone.
Most importantly, the revised will included a provision that specifically excluded Cassandra from any benefit, regardless of her legal relationship to Michael. Even if they had reconciled, which seemed impossible given their divorce proceedings, she would have no access to any family wealth. When we shared the news of the estate revision with Michael during one of his Sunday visits, his response confirmed that our assessment of his transformation had been accurate. "Thank you," he said simply. "But I want you to know that I'm not expecting anything anymore. The fact that you're willing to include me in your legacy after what I put you through means more than the money itself." That evening, as Harold and I sat in our living room, reflecting on the extraordinary year we'd experienced, I realized that Cassandra's campaign of harassment and manipulation had ultimately accomplished something she never could have intended.
By forcing us to examine our family relationships and clarify our values, she had helped us create an estate plan that truly reflected our priorities and protected our legacy from people who might misuse it. By systematically demonstrating her unsuitability as an inheritor, she had eliminated herself from consideration while helping Michael recognize the importance of genuine character over inherited entitlement. Her months of calculating our net worth and planning to control our assets had resulted in her complete exclusion from the wealth she'd been so determined to inherit. Her systematic harassment had been comprehensively documented and legally defeated. Her marriage to our son had collapsed under the weight of her financial motivations and manipulative behavior. Meanwhile, our relationships with Thomas, Rachel, and eventually Michael had been strengthened through the process of protecting our autonomy and dignity. Our estate planning reflected our actual values rather than automatic family obligations. Our legacy was secure in the hands of people who understood that wealth represents responsibility rather than entitlement. 6 months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Cassandra had moved to another state, apparently starting over with a different identity and a new set of potential targets for her calculated approach to relationships. I felt no satisfaction in her continued struggles, but I felt profound gratitude that our family had been protected from someone who viewed love as a transaction and family relationships as financial opportunities. The cosmic justice that had begun with a desperate request for $75,000 was now complete. Cassandra had lost not just the inheritance she'd been planning to control, but also her marriage, her community standing, and her access to the family she'd tried to manipulate. Sometimes the universe delivers justice with perfect timing and absolute precision. And sometimes that justice comes served with pancakes on a gray October morning by parents who refused to let their life's work be controlled by people who had never learned the difference between earning respect and demanding inheritance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.